Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 462. All right, guys, welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise awareness of trauma and to support new trauma therapists just starting out on their trauma-informed journey. I do that through this podcast and my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0. If you're a therapist of any kind, interested in learning about trauma, and you're looking for support and inspiration, I invite you to check out Trauma Therapist 2.0 by going to traumatherapist2.com. That's traumatherapist, the number 2.com. All right, let's get started. This episode is sponsored by cptsdfoundation.org. And one of the great things about, for me, about doing this podcast is that I get to speak to and work with amazing people. And Athena Moberg, the CEO and founder of cptsdfoundation.org, is one of those individuals. This woman is on fire. I got to meet her several months ago here in San Francisco. We had breakfast together and just had a really great talk. And I got to learn about her foundation and what they're doing. They provide complex trauma survivors and practitioners with compassionate support, skills, and trauma-informed education. Athena works together with expert practitioners and treatment centers, offering daily touch points to anyone currently in trauma therapy or who wants a safe place to come, feel heard and validated between therapy appointments. Some of the resources they offer are daily recovery support, a healing book club. They have free support groups. They also offer this really cool thing where they can send you texts just to encourage you and help you heal on your journey. So check them out at cptsdfoundation.org/trauma therapist podcast. Once again, that's cptsdfoundation.org/trauma therapist podcast. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have it back as my guest, Michael Salter. Michael, welcome.
Yeah, really good to be here, Guy.
All right, man. So Associate Professor Michael Salter is a criminologist and Scientia Fellow at the University of New South Wales, where he undertakes research on child sexual exploitation, complex trauma, and gendered violence. He's the author of Organized Sexual Abuse, published by Routledge, which examines the narratives of adults who were sexually abused by groups of perpetrators as children. Also, Crime, Justice, and Social Media, also published by Routledge, which details how social media and the internet is impacting sexual offenses and discussions about them. Michael sits on the board of directors of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, who awarded him in 2018 the Morton Prince Award for Scientific Achievement. He's a national and international consultant to child protection agencies, including the Australian Child Sexual Abuse Prevention Service and the Canadian Centre for Child Protection. He's also a practicing Buddhist and has taught a weekly meditation class at his local temple for the last 10 years. And he lives in Sydney with his husband and cat. Awesome. Well, very excited to have you back.
Yeah, really good to be here.
So a lot's been going on since we last spoke. You were on episode 362 of this podcast, and I'll direct people to check that out to give kind of a context and background. But so let's start off here. So, before we were recording here, I asked you how things were going. Share with our listeners how you're doing, given this whole epidemic and everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a really crazy year for us. Here in Australia, we started with the bushfires. So we had massive, unprecedented fires and a really peculiar situation, for months and months where the city was actually covered in smoke. When you went outside, the sun was red, the sunlight was red, and that went on for months and months. So it was actually a really, really draining, strange start to the year. And I think a broad sense of a lack of leadership as well. Like the country felt very unsafe. We didn't feel as though our political leaders were making the decisions they needed to keep us safe. And this is also a climate change induced crisis for us here in Australia. The bushfires are larger and more frequent because of climate change. And then within a couple of months of the bushfires coming under control, COVID kicked off. Mm-hmm. And I was overseas at the time. I was meant to spend most of the first half of this year overseas. and so I had to fly back as soon as possible.
Wow.
Came in just before the borders closed, and we've really been on lockdown. A little bit different for us. We locked down very early. We're a different country. We're smaller. Our population's quite dispersed. So in my state, we haven't had any community transmission of COVID now for over 2 weeks. So all of our restrictions are lifting and people feel quite safe. Mm-hmm. So we're transitioning out of that, but we've certainly been watching events in the United States with a lot of interest. We have significant problems with structural and institutional racism here in Australia, particularly relating to our Aboriginal Australians. And so we've just had some quite large, I haven't seen protests this big since the Iraq War. Huge protests in all capital cities around Black Lives Matter this weekend.
Oh. So for those listeners who haven't checked out that first podcast, the interview that we did, give those listeners just kind of a basic idea of what it is you do. What's driving you?
So I'm a criminologist. So I study criminal offences. I study criminal harm, and what I'm particularly interested in is the sorts of violence and abuse that's committed against people with a dissociative disorder and with complex trauma. So a lot of my work is looking at organised child sexual abuse and premeditated child sex offending. And I do a lot of interview-based work, particularly with women with dissociative identity disorder, because the sorts of childhood experiences they disclose, but also the kinds of adult abuse and exploitation they experience is really poorly understood. And what I find, not only in my own country, but when I do work in the UK or the United States, is these other countries, just like mine, don't have the service arrangements in place to support people with dissociative and complex trauma to not just recover from the abuse, but to prosecute the offenders who harmed them or to keep them safe from ongoing abuse. So that's really what gets me out of bed in the morning.
Okay. So what you said, certain peoples or communities or countries even don't have the resources to or don't understand what's going on here. What are they not understanding?
Generally, complex trauma, I think, is a paradigm shift. It's a paradigm in the sense that it challenges the pre-existing in mental health. It challenges the pre-existing psychiatric set of assumptions about what is mental illness and where does mental illness come from. And so, we're all of our mental health systems are grounded in psychiatric and psychological expertise. But unfortunately, as far as complex trauma is concerned, those foundational assumptions just are not a good fit with the reality of trauma and the reality of the lives of traumatized people. And that's also true of the criminal justice system and of law enforcement. They are not trained in a trauma-informed model. They don't think in the way that those of us who work in the trauma field think. And as a result, we consistently find that people with complex trauma are just a bad fit for so many of the services and the systems that have been set up supposedly to support them and protect them. But they're like a square peg in a round hole. We've just finished quite a large study here in Australia, and it's publicly available. It's about 170 pages. It's a massive bit of work for us. We interviewed 40 women with complex trauma, and we interviewed over 60 professionals who work in a range of different sectors. So we interviewed not just mental health, but people working in child protection, alcohol and drug, homelessness, legal services, about their experience with clients with complex trauma. And it was an interview-based study because we were really trying to get a sense of, what's the inside experience for women with complex trauma as they're not just approaching mental health, but they're approaching police. They're intersecting with the child protection system. They need treatment for alcohol and drug issues and so on. What's their experience of those systems? And this idea of just not fitting just came up time and time again. They're just not getting what they need. And ultimately, that's not a clinical issue, that's a public policy issue. And we walked away from the study with really this sense of complex trauma being a different paradigm than the assumptions that most systems are set up on.
So, for example, looking through the eyes of one of the workers you interviewed, what might they have said in this study? What was a common response, in a sense?
Yeah, so we had, one of the interviews that really sticks out for me was he was a nurse who'd started working in an emergency department, and he now worked in a community-based health system, which he really liked and he felt was doing really good work with complex trauma. But he was talking about how, when people presented to the emergency department when he was a nurse, you'd never ask them about their history. You don't want to know their history because all that you care about in an emergency department is their presenting issue. You want to know how injured they are and what's the, what are their care needs right now. And he said, in an emergency department, trauma means injury. Trauma means what's happened to you right now. And he said, now in my new job in this community-based mental health system, trauma means history. Trauma doesn't mean right now. Trauma means what happened to you. And I think it was a really good illustration where we have a lot of systems that are set up, firstly for people in crisis, because we do a bad job of intervening early before people have escalated to crisis. But then when they present in crisis, we just look at their presenting issue. We look at their symptoms. We look at what they need right now. And that really does harm to people with complex trauma because we need to see them as a whole person, particularly when they present in crisis, because often they present in crisis quite messy. They can be really difficult. They can be really challenging. And that's not the whole person. If that's all that we see them as, which many systems do, then we do an injury to them in addition to the injury that they're presenting with because we invalidate them, we dismiss them, we trivialize them, and we don't understand the complexity of their presenting issue. And then we don't treat them correctly.
Right. As you're talking, I'm thinking to myself of just this whole topic. Every time, I remember when you and I first talked, I was just struck by, and I remember using this word, the intensity of what you do. I mean, complex, ritualized trauma. There's no getting around it. I mean, it's ugly. It hits you on a gut level. To what degree did this topic come up in these interviews, if at all? Just the sheer kind of existential difficulty of talking about this and confronting this topic.
Just because of the work that I do, and we also had one of the other investigators in this study was Warwick Middleton, who's also a very well-known specialist in dissociative identity disorder. So of the 40 women that we interviewed, I think it was at least 6 had a diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder. And we spoke to other women who would probably have met the criteria as well. And, of those 40 women, what was really interesting and really important was just how diverse their experiences were. We talk about domestic violence, we talk about sexual assault, but that didn't really capture the things that were happening to them. One of the women that we interviewed, she'd been quite severely sexually abused by her parents when she was a kid, and she was now in her mid-30s, and at the time of interview was still living at home with her parents, who were still abusing her because she was too unwell to leave. She'd tried to leave before, but she couldn't maintain her independence because she was just psychologically, she was too unwell to live without support. And it was a really kind of striking moment in the interview. She approached a public housing service looking for social housing, and she explained her situation to them. And she was quite vocal about what was happening to her. She didn't really keep it quiet, so people knew about it. And the public housing bureaucrat said to her, "Well, look, your parents aren't they might be abusing you, but they're not threatening to kill you, so you're not really a priority for us." And he gave her a pamphlet on how to prepare for homelessness, so that if she left home and she became homeless, she had a resource to help her be homeless. So we, certainly in this study, we came across a lot of organised abuse for women, both women who'd survived organised abuse in childhood and some women where that was continuing into adulthood. And just the absolute cliff of there was just nothing available for them. And professionals talk to us a lot about this as well. So one professional said to me, I don't have the words for some of the things that are happening to my clients. And the vulnerability of some adult clients. If a child is being abused, then we have statutory obligations to report those to services, and those services are obliged by legislation to protect that child. Mm-hmm. We can talk about whether they do a good job or not, which is probably another podcast. But she was talking about the fact that wasn't the case for her adult clients, some of whom, again, still being abused, unable to keep themselves safe, and whose job was it to support them and protect them. So this was really an issue in this study that we wanted to situate within the broader spectrum of violence against women, including more commonly recognised forms such as domestic and intimate partner violence.
So what do you think needs what needs to happen? I mean, obviously on a macro level, on a micro level, but what are some of the beginning steps? All right, guys, just quickly, I want to thank Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute for being a sponsor on this podcast. Do you struggle to help numb, disconnected clients who can't feel emotion or explore inner experience? Learn a comprehensive approach to conceptualize your client's concerns. As someone who's gone through the level 1 and level 2 trainings of sensorimotor psychotherapy training, I can really speak to the power of this training. For me, it was a game changer and is so inspiring. Sensorimotor psychotherapy uniquely includes the body in therapy as both a source of information and a target for intervention, because words are not enough. Go beyond theories and gain practical ways to open a new dimension for effective therapy. Visit Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute online today at sensorimotor.org. That's sensorimotor.org.
We need a significant shift in psychological and psychiatric education. Most mental health professionals leave they leave university with little to no literacy in trauma, which is absolutely just really hard to understand when you look at the burden of trauma-related mental illness in the community. There's clearly a disjunction between tertiary curricula, so university curricula in mental health, and the actual demand in the community. So we really do need accrediting bodies like the American Psychological Association to require universities and to ensure that everyone who's graduating to practice clinically is actually at least competent in trauma. So I think that would be a huge change, and I suspect it's coming, but we are going to need to push for it because these organisations are not moving quickly enough. And then, we need an honest conversation about our mental health system. And I know that the United States has been really talking about some of the issues and challenges in your health system, which is quite different to ours. But, we have when we look at complex trauma, this is a group of people with multiple presenting issues who are then going into a health system where each agency is funded often to address one thing. And so if you're a person with 5 things, you can't find one agency that can provide you with all the things you need. And for some of the women that we interviewed, they were bouncing between 6 or 7 appointments every week. And those appointments were really geographically dispersed. So they're trying to raise their kids because they're a mum. They're trying to cope with complex trauma, and they're bouncing between 7 appointments that might be an hour's drive each way. So yeah, there's a lot to do here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I do want to get to the topic of the internet, when I think it's very topical right now. But before we go there, do you talk to clinicians or therapists? What do you hear from them? What are they needing to know? What are they yearning for?
Yeah, I mean, I do a lot of work with therapists and mental health workers. I provide a lot of training. I think the particularly in the complex trauma work, a really key aspect of complex trauma is hopelessness. That's part of the experience of complex trauma is hopelessness, and it's infectious as well. If you're not prepared for it, if you come in to do work with clients with complex trauma, it's really easy to take on their hopelessness. And I think, one of the most important messages always to clinicians is hope, actually, and is, just to let people know that they have what their clients need. It doesn't mean that they can't skill up, they can't learn new techniques. But I will say, often when I'm doing training and I'm there to talk about the content and I'm there to, provide information, but also that kind of spirit of hope to say to people, it's not going to be easy, but you can do this is important. At the same time, recognizing the limitations of the systems that we're in. And I think we do, those of us at the front line who are practitioners, we do need to speak with a voice. We do need to be political. And we do need to advocate for our clients because at the moment, the systems are not supporting them to live safe, happy lives. And we shouldn't be quiet about that. And we need to come up with our own solutions as well. It's not enough just to complain. We need to have a blueprint for change.
Do you think that, you talked about a paradigm shift. Do you think that this topic is becoming more exposed, more commonplace? Are the discussions happening more and more?
I think that it absolutely is because we are, I think, pushing up against the limits of the previous psychological and psychiatric paradigm. I think it's taken us as far as it can, but it's just not delivering gains for enough people, and we can't ignore trauma anymore. It's just breaking the system apart, basically, and so the system is going to have to adjust. And it has been because of trauma. Therapists and experts and researchers who have just documented and frankly, survivors. We always need to give credit to survivors who have been agitating and advocating for decades as well. So I think this conversation is much more public and visible. This study that we've just finished, we've actually got funding as part of the study to do a series of policy roundtables where we're going to 3 capital cities, including Canberra, which is our national capital. And we're not talking to therapists, we're talking to policymakers. We're getting people into the room once once we're allowed to with COVID, getting people into the room and saying to them, well, what are the implications for you as someone who makes these decisions and controls the funding levers? Because really the conclusion that we came away with from the complex trauma study is this isn't working. We need to do things differently.
Wow. All right. So shifting gears here a little, your book, Crime, Justice, and Social Media, which was published in 2017. I mean, just the topic of social media and crime and justice, but trauma also. I mean, to me, it just feels like it's exponentially negatively impacting and exacerbating this whole issue in a sense. What was your impetus for writing the book in the first place?
I was invited probably about 8 years ago now, and it was because of my work in organised abuse and particularly the manufacture of child sexual abuse material. So I was invited to come in on a study looking at young people's use of technology because for the first time, what we were starting to see in 2012, or what we're starting to realise, is that if you give teenagers phones, internet-connected phones that have cameras in them, one of the things that some teenagers do is start taking nude photos of themselves. And, child pornography legislation was not written with the defence in it for self-manufacture by minors because nobody imagined in 1978 that young people, children, would ever be in a position to manufacture images of themselves. And so I came in on a study looking at sort of young people and sex and technology. And it's really just sort of expanded from there. I now work quite a lot internationally and here in Australia around online pedophile rings and online harms, and that's a really important part of my work. And one of the things that it has made visible is just the extent of demand in the community for child sexual abuse material. This is not a small black market. This is not niche. We're looking at somewhere between 2 to 4% of men in the community have regularly accessed child sexual abuse material. We also face, frankly, a technology industry that has not taken this issue seriously for 20 years because it just financially wasn't in their interest to admit how much online child abuse was happening. And we're now in a position where, the United States authorities last year received 70 million, and I'll repeat that, 70 million reports of online child sexual abuse images and videos in 2019.
Oh my God. I mean, it's astounding and it's depressing. I mean, and I'm thinking to myself, how, as someone who was a therapist, and obviously a lot of therapists are listening to this, what do they need to know about this topic in the sense of, you talked about hope, but more than that, what do you say to them?
I think, when you work in the trauma field and you hear, it's like working in a parallel universe. You hear clients disclosing things, talking about things. It's like a substratum of the human condition that's invisible to kind of mainstream society. And it's one of the things that can be quite alienating and isolating about working in complex trauma. Look, one of the things I'll say about the internet is that it makes all of this very, very visible. And it makes it undeniable. Now, yes, the internet is also, it's a medium for a lot of harm. It's causing a lot of harm, but also it's bringing to light a lot of issues that have been buried for a long time. And I'd also say, look, the internet's the reason why you and I are connecting right now. It's the reason why, your audience is connecting with you. It's the reason why, many survivors are much more empowered than they were in the past because of the internet. So I think, I have to remind myself working in the online space, the internet's done a lot, and it's done a lot for the trauma field. It's not all bad, although sometimes, frankly, it feels that way.
One of the things that I wanted to bring up, and since we talked, however many months ago that was, I follow you on Twitter, and you're pretty active there, and I noticed that, there's a contingency of, people who are flat out disbelieve what we're talking about.
Yes.
Talk about that.
Yeah.
And where do you start with that?
Yeah, look, particularly in the online space, just the internet, tech companies have to pay the piper at some point. Look, they've ignored this for a long time. But I think also that, I grew up with, I was a teenager in the 90s. I grew up with the myth of the internet. I grew up with this myth that, the internet was going to free us and it was going to save us. And it was this incredible, exciting, democratic, anarchist space that was going to liberate us. And, the internet's done none of those things, frankly. The internet's been captured by a number of, enormous corporate companies who have happily circulated, propaganda about how magic the internet is. And we need to kind of wake up from the dream. And we need to admit how bad things have gotten when it comes to online child abuse. And I think that's hard, not just for tech companies who don't want to have that conversation, but it's hard for, for people like me who want to believe in the promise of the internet. And it just hasn't delivered.
So you think the kind of disbelief is coming more from a kind of a from grander, if you will, or corporate structure?
Look, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those of us that work in this space, there are things that I am shocked. My jaw is frequently on the floor about the inaction of tech companies, and frankly, their disinterest in child protection. And I think this is the other piece that's hard for tech companies and hard for the community, which is that, we have not just legal obligations to children, we have moral obligations to keep children safe. If you are an adult, you have a moral obligation to keep children safe. And children are on the internet, therefore, the internet needs to be child safe. Yeah, we need to build in safety measures to protect children. We need to build those measures into the infrastructure of the internet, or else we are just going to keep seeing, this cycle of abuse continue online. And that's difficult for people to wrap their heads around. They don't want to think about kids. They just want to think about their own needs, frankly.
I just want to remind everyone that I'm speaking with Dr. Michael Salter. Michael, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Look, always Twitter, now that we've been slagging off the internet. Twitter, Mike_Salter at Twitter, or via email is great. I love to hear from people.
Okay, and I'll have that linked up at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Now, you mentioned this study. Can you send me a link to that?
Yes.
And can people access that? Okay. So as we get ready to close out here, again, people are listening to this. I mentioned, a lot of therapists and so forth, survivors, coaches, therapists of all kinds. Who's doing a good job in terms of recognizing this? I mentioned in your bio, the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. But in addition to them, but who's doing a good job in terms of blowing this open, of recognizing this, of providing education?
Look, we can't underestimate the power of the grassroots. And the last couple of months, I've been partnering with a local women's health service here in my state. They came up separately from me, but I think it's brilliant. They came up with this idea of a one-stop shop for complex trauma. So it's the Illawarra Women's Health Service, and they've come up with this model, and it's called the Women's Trauma Recovery Centre. And the idea is that this is one place for their community where women with complex trauma can come and get their needs met. So what Illawarra has done is they've gotten a little bit of funding from our state government to develop the model. And so they're currently co-designing the Women's Recovery Centre with women. And there's a really strong Aboriginal voice in this project. So the study is actually Aboriginal-led, and significant Aboriginal leadership is part of it. And so our aim is that in a year's time, we'll actually have a model that's partly costed that we can then go to the government and say, this is what we need. This is what this region needs. But for me, it's really exciting. I've never heard of anything like this before. And I think it's a really amazing model for us to think about in terms of trauma care, where there would be therapists, but there'd also be physiotherapists, and there would be case managers, and there would be good, warm relationships with local law enforcement, and there'd be housing and so on. So I think that's amazing. And it also just tells us something about the grassroots. So yes, there's my organisation, so the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. We're seeing more and more momentum in the American Psychological Association and other psychology and psychiatry associations around the world. So that's really important. But yeah, the one thing that I would say to people that are listening is don't devalue your voice and the change that you can make at a local level, because that's real change.
Awesome. Man, Michael, I love talking to you. You are one inspired dude, and always welcome back here. So again, Dr. Michael Salter will have everything linked up here at the show notes page. And again, be well, my friend.
You too, mate. Thank you.
All right, take care. This episode is sponsored by CPTSDFoundation.org. One of the great things about for me about doing this podcast is that I get to speak to and work with amazing people. And Athena Moberg, the CEO and founder of cptsdfoundation.org, is one of those individuals. This woman is on fire. I got to meet her several months ago here in San Francisco. We had breakfast together and just had a really great talk. And I got to learn about her foundation and what they're doing. They provide complex trauma survivors and practitioners with compassionate support, skills, and trauma-informed education. Athena works together with expert practitioners and treatment centers, offering daily touch points to anyone currently in trauma therapy or who wants a safe place to come, feel heard and validated between therapy appointments. Some of the resources they offer are daily recovery support, a healing book club. They have free support groups. They also offer this really cool thing where they can send you texts just to encourage you and help you heal on your journey. So check them out at cptsdfoundation.org/trauma therapist podcast. Once again, that's cptsdfoundation.org/trauma therapist podcast.